Hello, my name is Jonathan Trull. I'm the CISO for Qualys. Have been in that role for the last 5 years and worked as CISO in different organizations and all the way from a security auditor, risk analyst, up to a SOC engineer, and then eventually a CISO. So glad to be here, and I've got a very special guest with me, Rahul. Would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hello. My name is Rahul Goel. I have a lot of experience in software engineering, IT, strategy, and planning, and most recently spent about a decade in cybersecurity, leading security technologies in financial services and insurance sector.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to have a really great interactive conversation today. So, as the title says, it's Beyond the SOC, building a risk operations center for the enterprise. And for many of you, the Risk Operations Center, or ROC, may be a new term, but it's this emerging concept and model that is trying to unify all of the different technical risk signals that an organization receives on a daily basis to make well informed decisions to mitigate, remediate risks. And it's a companion to a security operations center, or SOC, that many in the industry have known about for quite some time, probably worked in, potentially hired people. But it's not replacing a SOC. It's a companion to. The model is that you would have both a security operations center and a risk operations center operating at the same time. And so, with this topic, we're going to discuss a few different things. One is about, what are the key considerations when you're evaluating or planning for a ROC? How do existing programs, how can they be modernized to fit into this new framework and model? What are the skill sets that people need who are working in a risk operations center? How does it differ from a security operations center? Does it need to be 24 by 7 and operational? What are the core strategies for making it effective to operate at an enterprise level? So we're going to dig into all of these topics. And with that, we're going to jump right in. So, Raul, as an early adopter of the Risk Operations Center concept, what initially drew you to it? What motivated you to take that first step, or to say, hey, we need a different way of working?
Yeah, John, we did have a SOC which was very reactive to any events that we were noticing in an environment, but a parallel work stream that we had was around all the cyber related threats and hygiene issues that we had within our organization. And it felt a little bit like a whack-a-mole. We were chasing data security events, we were chasing cloud security posture events, we were AppSec, network, endpoint, identity. It seemed like every day there was a different thing we were chasing, and that just became unmanageable. We needed to explain to our stakeholders within IT and business why these priorities are changing. When the Qualys team introduced the SOC, it just made sense because it brings all of these things together, puts a risk context on it, and helps us prioritize what is it that we should be remediating and addressing with kind of the most impact within the organization from a cybersecurity standpoint. The Rock was also going to help us kind of build out our cybersecurity metrics in terms of the key areas of consideration, how we tie it all together, overlay asset criticality, data criticality, whether it's external, internal, and just kind of help prioritize in a very uniform way that would also resonate with our stakeholders who were really performing majority of the remediations. And the dynamic cyber landscape that we had, and they were shifting priorities every day. This just helped present the mitigation efforts a little bit more cohesively.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, and it's I think, working with you and others, one of the reasons that we've really like dug in on this idea of a risk operations center is, we've seen over the years, there's been so much effort on threat detection and bringing all those signals together, bringing them into your SIM, having one team view and analyze it and automate responses, right, to events. Yet then when you looked at like risk, vulnerability management, exposure management, external exposure management, it was still so fragmented. There were multiple different teams working on these exposures. Sometimes the context wasn't being pulled together about the underlying assets that those exposures were related to. And so we saw this divide, where you had this significant, maturation of the SOC, but you didn't see the relative same movement for dealing with risk. It's still just seemed across large enterprises to be very piecemeal. Again, signals all over the place being ingested or looked at by numerous different teams. And we know with any new approach, model, technology, there's always resistance or challenges to getting something rolled out. So for large organizations, what are some of the biggest drivers to really help push this model forward at scale, right? Like how do you see pushing this idea of operationalizing risk management at scale as a core driver for a security program?
Yeah, for us, like I mentioned previously, given the disparate initiatives around improving security posture and given the pushback and resistance from our stakeholders, there was already enough catalyst to kind of bring it all together and put kind of a risk lens to every remediation that needed to be performed and which one's more important, what's the return on that remediation, etc. So I think when we kind of embarked on the rock journey, the catalyst was already there to bring it all together and explain to our stakeholders, all the way from technology, business, the risk teams, and the board, to say, here's why we are doing it, here's the risk priority of these initiatives. That helped with a lot of planning and resource commits as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think I'm just curious what you found. I found that oftentimes, while the SOC was operating at a very quick pace, right? And an event comes in, you triage it, you take action. It's all about mean time to remediate, mean time to detect. I'm just curious on your thoughts because what I found as we were implementing our own ROC internally was that oftentimes, the risk process was a little bit less real time, I would say. Oftentimes there were audits or risk audits, and those tended to be pretty manual and would be written up in reports, and those reports would eventually get to management, and that takes time. It was more of a kind of a slow working process, and I think part of I know what I wanted to achieve was a more real time based view of risk and being able to triage those faster. I don't know. Did that resonate with you in terms of trying to like speed up kind of the ability to identify and deal with risk? Was that part of your reason for going to a ROC model as well?
For sure, it was. Again, for us, identification of risk was not that big a problem. For the size of our organization and the complex ecosystem we had, I think just
Mm.
remediating everything was the biggest problem.
Mm.
And the ROC helped us prioritize what were riskier items, what should we focus on top down, where we'll get the most bang in terms of our buck. I mean, any large organization, there's never an end state of zero risk, right? So it's always about, here's everything that's on the table. What are you going to prioritize? That's going to give you the most return in terms of mitigating risk within the organization. I think that's where the ROC helped us significantly. The technology that the Qualys team kind of built and the solution built certainly gave us the ability. to have the risk posture real time, but mostly in regulated industries, not what's your hourly risk posture. It's basically how are you addressing risk, how are you mitigating it over kind of a little bit of a long term, which could be 6 to 18 months, and what are the things you're focusing on. The other thing the Rock helped us was in terms of regulators, because financials, insurance, they're heavily regulated and audited. It helped us present a comprehensive risk posture to our regulators and auditors as well, where they were able to look at it and say, okay, you know, they may have considered some data risk as very high to remediate, but we were able to stitch it all together and say, here's the asset, here's the type of data, maybe it's public information. And that's why, as an organization, we decided this is not as high a risk item as some of the other things and the underlying assets and data that were potentially going to be.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. On so a slightly different, I guess, note is when you look at both the parallels and the differences between the evolution of a SOC and the emergence of a risk operations center. Like, what do you see as kind of the similarities but differences between the two?
Yeah, let me start with the differences. A SOC to me was always reactive. It was kind of a little bit more tactical. It was very event based, that you were reacting very rapidly. Of course, the reaction time depended on the severity of the incident, so to speak. A ROC to me was a little bit more strategic and longer term, where you're improving the risk posture of the organization from a cyber standpoint. Yeah, there are certain tactical aspects of it, but those would be the ones where you could have an overlap between the ROC and the SOC. If there's a new emerging threat, if there's something with a very high CDSS score that's being actively exploited, that's usually on our SOC's radar. Uh, we'll get the cyber defense team, we will do rapid response activities and quick patching. But the Rock was a lot more than just that. It was basically improving our cybersecurity risk posture over, like I said, 6 to 18 months, and bringing all the things together and putting that pane of glass. From a similarity standpoint, I would say we were our SOC obviously is 24/7. The Rock, because we have a global workforce, the Rock was going to be 24/7 as well. I was certainly thinking the Rock team complementing the SOC as well in terms of threat intelligence and emerging threats. Um, just a broader team to kind of manage remediation activities. So I saw a lot of similarities from that standpoint as well. Um, Foundationally, they were both relying on our native technology and tools, whether it's related to cloud or endpoint or application security, identity and access management. They were both reliant on kind of the same tech stack. So those were kind of the similarities as well. What was good was Rock kind of stitched it all together
Mm-hmm.
for our team. There was a separate group that working stakeholders around, what kind of patterns are we seeing in terms of our risk posture. It was a little bit strategic of a conversation versus a SOC being a very
Yeah,
reactive.
got it. No, that's great. Yeah, and I know for ours, we ended up, we think of it kind of as a fusion center. I would say where we in a well, to be 24/7, we both have multiple kind of physical spaces, so to speak. But ideally in those physical spaces, we sit what is kind of our network ops, net ops, on call SRE. If there's a problem with the stability of a platform from uptime, a cyber resilience perspective. We then have the risk operations center and the security operations center teams all kind of sitting together side by side. So again, it didn't replace one or the other, but I think, like you said, it's a great supplement for each of those teams to make them individually more effective and to collaborate better with each other as well. So. All right. So tell me about, I guess, as you're thinking about how can an organization modernize, like, let's just say an existing vulnerability management program. Let's just stick with that for the time being. How would that fit into kind of the ROC framework?
Yeah, the good thing about our vulnerability management program from an organization standpoint, they are hooks into all parts of the organization because they were already working through vulnerability remediation activities, whether it's network vulnerabilities, application vulnerabilities, endpoint, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the right team to leverage kind of expansion of the ROC capability. The one piece we had to kind of think through a little bit in terms of his skill set, because some aspect of the SOC skill set needed to be
Mm,
in kind of the vulnerability teams as well, because the ROC would give us not just vulnerability data, and that's what that team skill set was. They would be broader skill set than
mm,
just vulnerabilities. It's emerging threats. It's there's so many things in addition to vulnerability
mm,
management that the team had to do. So for us, skilling up a little bit in terms of better understanding of these threats that you would see out of a ROC. In addition to vulnerabilities, that's an area that we were starting to focus on. For example, cloud security, cloud configuration would be another
mm,
area. The ROC was pulling those in. Those were not really vulnerabilities per
mm,
se. Identity and access management related threats and issues would be another area. Usually, you wouldn't see expertise in a vulnerability management team around IAM and privileged access. So that was another piece that we were starting to do. Um, Not specific around rock, but in general, we were starting to train our teams on kind of the agentic AI and MCP because that had relevance across the board in all of our functions. Um, Identity and access management, non-human identities were starting to become a big attack surface and a risk for us. So that was an area of focus, and that's something we were starting to train across the team, across the board on all of our functional teams.
that's great. Yeah, yeah, definitely very similar. I think in our journey, where we kind of, I would say, started from two cores. I mean, at least internally for us, one was your vulnerability management program as a core, and the other one is, I had a separate team that was really focused on maintaining good visibility in terms of assets and unmanaged assets and which are managed, and then it covered both, like, did it have the right tool stack on it, was it configured properly, all those. So ended up finding it was a natural fit to kind of bring those two teams together a little bit more, and then that's kind of what we built off of eventually to be the Qualys Risk Operations Center. I think this next question is very interesting, which is, when you think about the skill sets that you would need for a ROC. I've seen a lot of things about, SOC analyst one, SOC analyst two, very defined patterns, and who, obviously this is a new thing, the ROC. So I'm curious, what kind of skill sets and experience do you look for a risk operations center?
Um, Again, like I said, folks that have a little bit of a broader understanding of cybersecurity than just vulnerability management. I think that was core to me. Somebody who had a good understanding of kind of the identity vertical or application security or network cloud configurations, a little bit of, for lack of a better term, all rounders and understanding. And we didn't have to have the entire team be just all of those folks, but felt the rock team needed to have experts,
Mm-hmm.
all rounded, that could speak to each of these functions, similar to how we have the SOC folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they can certainly extend and reach out to the SOC teams, but as much as possible, we try to make it a self sufficient team, and fully enabled to be able to perform what they need to do. Integrations on a rock platform was a very big deal. Integrations and kind of just monitoring and making sure all the data feeds are coming in.
Yeah.
Similar. we kind of do it in a SOC, or what you would do for SIM and detection engineering. That was another capability we felt we need in the ROC as well, because you're bringing all this data in. You got to make sure your integrations are up and running. You're building out new integrations. So those were kind of two areas. So cybersecurity expertise and kind of managing the platform from an integration and monitoring and things.
That's great. So looking again at I think the kind of final last kind of two questions are somewhat tied together, right? So one is, and we'll tackle them at the same time because I think they're related, right? So one is when you look at what strategies have worked to get the best leadership and board alignment around the ROC vision. And again, maybe it's not all the way up to the board. Maybe it's just with your leadership. Maybe it's with the CIO and other teams. So maybe you can share, how you did that. And then again, related, I think looking back at your ROC journey, just what kind of guidance would you leave to the audience? Don't do this. This didn't work. These were things I wish I would have done. But yeah, let's kind of wrap it up with that and just give me how you got this thing deployed and what you changed, if anything.
Yeah. Yeah, the Rock has a lot to offer, and you got to be very careful that you don't get carried away to bring everything in at the same time. I would just caution people on that. Pick your top data sources, your threat intel, if your cloud, your cloud logs, your AppSec, your vulnerability logs, sub identity logs. Start there. Start simple. Bring your asset inventory. Obviously, you want to know, what's the risk. Start with something basic and start socializing that. The technology folks will start appreciating it, because for the technology folks, there's always pushback that we get. There's so many security items we have to remediate. Once you bring it all together and show them, hey, we're stitching all these things together, and trying to prioritize what are the things that make sense and give us the biggest ROI in terms of risk reduction, that that resonates with them,
Yeah.
because that's the biggest complaint you hear from IT. There's so many security remediations we have to perform. So that was kind of relatively easy for us in terms of selling this. The board always wanted to understand better around our cyber risk metrics. The ROC was just a great foundation to be able to produce that metric and that view for the board. Um, I know there was a second part in terms of caution, that you were asking, and like I said, don't try to boil the ocean. Go after your critical data sources. I forgot to mention EDR and network logs. Like we wanted to make sure we brought those logs in as well, in addition to vulnerabilities, threat intel, cloud security, and things like that. And then just continue to fine tune it, because you have to define what your risk threshold is in the organization. Your asset management system will never be 100%. So you certainly have to make some assumptions and do all of those, and continue to refine. Um, it was a great journey for us, and um, really appreciate the vision Qualys had in terms of putting it all together and being able to resonate that with our stakeholders, both on the board side and.
Great. Yeah, no, that's and I think that really resonates with me. I feel like like you said, one of the biggest barriers, and not in full adoption, but just I think the idea of people trying to take on too much all at once with integration. Definitely see that, and the important thing, like you said, it's I'm a big fan of kind of the 80-20 rule, and I think you'll probably find that 80% of your risk can be pulled in through 20% of your technologies, and so if you really focus on those critical ones, and then obviously the phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, like you said, as you mature. But I've definitely seen, and listen, I remember this happening with a SOC 2, and then when it became a data lake, and you're expanding and trying to put more data into it, and suddenly before you know it, people are trying to throw everything in without actually rationalizing, like, what do I get out of this? What is the incremental value, that I'm getting from this risk signal? And I think the same danger is obviously I'm finding in the rock as well, right? Like, again, start with the core. I think that's great advice that you've provided the audience, and then again, you can focus on maturing it over time as needed. So that's great advice. Well, listen, it's always a pleasure having you with us, and I'm glad to have another CISO visionary who's looking to adopt the Risk Operations Center and focus on driving that. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it, and we hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, thank you, John. Great conversation. I appreciate it.